Patrick Grady.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what a privilege to follow the former Home Secretary, and it's really lit up. You know, there was comparisons earlier on that this was the next episode in a box set. I think we've actually just seen the first act of the next round of the next Conservative leadership contest, and no doubt the sketch writers and everybody else paying attention have suddenly woken up. I mean, she made some incredibly interesting comments. She spoke about vows that were made to British people after referendums and elections. I remember a vow being made in 2014 about how the Scottish Parliament was going to become the greatest, most powerful, devolved Parliament in the entire world, and look how that one turned out. And she's right, the government will be held to account, and Parliament will exercise its opportunity to have a say on these issues, and that's why the amendments from her and her honourable friends were voted down last night, and that's why they'll be voted down again this evening. I'm incredibly confident. And then come the election, a majority of members of Parliament, and that includes a majority of members of Scottish National Party MPs in Scotland, will be returned to this House and will vote to repeal this bill, assuming that the bill ever makes it on to the statute book in the first place, Madam Deputy Speaker, because in reality, this was supposed to be, what is playing out is not a debate specifically about this legislation, but about the future of the Conservative Party. And not just the future of the Conservative Party, in fact, some of the past of the Conservative Party as well. It's been a real privilege in some ways to debate against the Maastricht rebels of old, and having the opportunity during my time in this House to debate against people who were on the television when I was studying for my Modern Studies standard grade 30 years ago, and they still can't get that determination to rebel against the government out of their system. It doesn't really matter what the government's proposing. You know that the member for Stone and the member for Gainsborough and the member for Woking and all the rest of it are just going to be against it because they love that sweet taste of rebellion. But the rest of us have better things to do with our time. We need to get on and demonstrate what our constituents actually think about this bill. We heard at great length from the member for Stone yesterday about the wonderful concept of parliamentary sovereignty, even though the clause that explicitly recognises parliamentary sovereignty is actually in today's grouping of debate, and that's the clause that my Amendment 31 would remove. And the reason for that is because the assertion of parliamentary sovereignty in a bill like this is actually a bit of an innovation, and I'd be quite interested if the Minister was able to respond to this point a little bit later on. This idea of including in a bill the language that Parliament is sovereign is, in fact, as I say, a little bit of an innovation. With the help of the House of Commons Library, the only other instance that I've been able to find is in the EU Withdrawal Act 2020. Now, there are other examples of legislation which imply parliamentary sovereignty, imply the ability of this House ultimately to override courts and make its own decisions. Some of that is in some of the founding legislation that took us into the European Union in the first place. Some of it's in the acts that established the Devolution settlement. But this line asserting that Parliament is sovereign is something of a legislative innovation. And given how lyrical the member for Stone waxed yesterday about the wonder of an unwritten constitution, it slightly strikes me that this is a form of codifying the concept of parliamentary sovereignty. It strikes me as this is perhaps actually writing down aspects of the UK constitution. And this seems to me a random piece of migration legislation, which, as we say, may or may not ever actually make it onto the statute book. It seems a very interesting way to go about codifying the UK constitution. The other reason for my amendment, though, is the one quoted both by the member for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath yesterday during his 10-minute rule bill, and my honourable learned friend for Edinburgh South West earlier on, when she quoted the constitutional expression, when she quoted the constitutional tradition expressed by Lord Cooper in the case of McCormick versus the Lord Advocate in 1953, that the principle of unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctly English principle which has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. And my honourable and learned friend spoke with far greater experience than I can about what the significance of that ruling means, and indeed the wider significance of Scotland's historically independent legal system to this debate and to this legislation. And that perhaps explains my amendments 4 and 5, which remove Scotland from the extent clause of the bill, because despite what the member for Fareham seems to think about the opinions of the British public and the British voters, voters in Glasgow North want no part of this. And I know that because I speak to them on a very regular basis. And a significant number of them, frankly, are asylum seekers who come to my surgery on a regular basis, and I hear the horror stories, not just of what they've experienced in their countries of origin, but of their experience of trying to deal with the Home Office. And frankly, perhaps if more asylum seekers knew that that was what they were on the receiving end of, maybe it would have the kind of deterrent effect that the Home Office is so desperate to try to achieve. But in reality, Scotland always has been a country that welcomes refugees, asylum seekers, those who want to make their home and contribute something to our society, just as so many countries did around the world, who welcomed Scots when they were cleared off their land to make way for sheep, or when their crops fell victim to blight, or in the modern world, who want to study around the world or practice their professions overseas. And that's why I also support the amendments from my honourable friend, the member for Edinburgh South West, that the Scottish Parliament should be asked to give its consent to this bill before it takes effect north of the border. Because in reality, the Scottish Parliament will not give its consent to this motion, because it is not what the people in Scotland want to see, or how we think a humane system of asylum should take part. The bill talks about the safety of Rwanda. I asked the Prime Minister about this earlier today. I asked him if Rwanda is a safe country, if it's a comfortable place. And I asked the Minister this yesterday as well. If Rwanda is a safe country, if Rwanda is a comfortable place in which people can live out their lives having been granted asylum, why would the principle of being why would the potential of being deported there be a deterrent? It doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense. And the Minister's answer and the Prime Minister's answer was the same. It's, well, because Rwanda isn't the UK. So the fact that Rwanda, that not being the UK is itself in a deterrent. So by the same logic, if the government came to an agreement with Disneyland and threatened to deport asylum seekers to Disneyland if they arrived here by irregular means, that too would be a deterrent, because it is not the United Kingdom. Sadly, there is not yet a Disneyland in the United Kingdom, though I suspect sometimes people look at this place and wonder exactly where the fantasy in all of this is. So by the government's own logic, the bill fails under the weight of its contradictions, and that's the point of the definition of the safety of Rwanda, which is in Clause 1, Madam Chair. So the bill fails under the weight of its own contradictions, and you could see that in the contradictory amendments that have been proposed by the 2 or 5 or however many opposing factions there are on the Conservative benches. So the former Home Secretary was right. The public will have their say on this bill, and after the next election, the government that is returned, I'm confident, and that will include members from the Scottish National Party who will be prepared to support any legislation that comes forward to repeal this bill, assuming, as I say, it makes it onto the statute book in the first place.